It's that time again of the quarter where we find out the new additions and subtractions from the Standard & Poor's Index or S&P. Now, taking place on Friday, June 7th, so marked on the rebalance calendar, and that's for all to look forward to, of course. But for those curious, the actual changes to take place will be on the 21st. But since that's already known a couple weeks ahead on the 7th, it's more of just the official mark of when the index will apply the changes. But let me know down in the comments first if you think it will actually happen for Palantir this quarter, and if not, when you think it actually would for them to be added. Additionally, will this have an actual effect on the price? Because we've been seeing institutions buying, and a lot are pointing to this anticipation to the addition of the index, so feel free below to discuss. Now, first, I have no idea if Palantir will be added or not. We already know for a long time they've been technically eligible, but of course they ain't the only kid on the block who is and is waiting in line to be added. So that's your fair warning and where I stand on that. But the main point of this video is really more from a longer term perspective of an investor. And obviously, if you're in it only for the short term and trading on this catalyst, it doesn't really make sense. But in my own personal opinion, I don't really care when Palantir gets added to the S&P 500. And like a lot of things, I view this more of a byproduct of them already being a good company. Now, if they never make it at any point, that speaks much more loudly over the long term about how the company performs or falls short, but we'll just leave it for that. Now, I want to start off first, though. It is still important to achieve this with tangible benefits, but timing is not making or breaking the company itself right now, but can have real consequences to the fundamentals legitimately and actually prove useful, which is the prestige and level of establishment that Palantir could exude to their customers and partners, and in making any deals and partnerships, of course. So obviously it takes a great deal to be in the S&P 500 or even just be eligible, and this will open more doors just by the sheer name recognition that can come with it along, because for some places it just hits a check mark or just goes through their filter just to be even a reputable vendor or partner to work with them. So I definitely don't want to diminish the power and of herd mentality and proxy measures of this reputation with the S&P, because we all do it in our own everyday lives anyways for smaller things, even if we don't notice it. So it could be the extra oomph if there might be a slight hesitation for a risk-averse customer, and also for the name recognition, it just increases the chances that much more for the press for Palantir, especially when it does happen. But even residually for the name recognition or S&P recognition, when someone Googles them or is hearing about them from a colleague, you know how the game goes. And even if not relevant to Palantir right now, being in the index does provide greater access to the capital markets and taking on debt at a cheaper rate. Obviously, this is not in the cards for Palantir right now from what we've seen from management and their current strategy, but maybe down the line, depending on their accounting, it can make some sense to take out loans and borrow against a cash hoard like other tech giants that we've seen. But we'll leave it at that for the long-term future if that even becomes relevant to Palantir. But I also think a lot of people on the surface always think about the price, or more importantly, the underlying kind of reasons, the decreasing in volatility and stability in demand for the shares. And this actually is a pro and a con, at least in my opinion, when it comes to the S&P inclusion. So starting with the con, specifically on the demand of shares, considering the requirement of meeting the indices allocation for any big players that have these index tracking products and need some level of exposure. So they're basically forced to buy Palantir. Technically, this adds to the demand artificially because it's not necessarily a vote of confidence in the company itself and its fundamentals as an investment, well, at least by itself in a vacuum, being in the index also being a factor. But then some might argue, well, being added to the S&P is part of my research and I won't even look at them. So you can make this circular argument, but in turn, you're already assuming the higher price entry point because it's a risk-off event, bringing more confidence to investors generally and more broadly. So you get the point. But this kind of applies while you're accumulating shares and already confident in the company. And if this doesn't change anything, then you pretty much just have to pay a higher price here. But if you haven't reached that allocation you found yourself happy with, then this is the issue. Essentially, the con is you pay more because now while you build a long-term position, the risk-off event is shared with the whole market. Now, for the pro, of course, the price and demand going up is obviously if you've already bought your position and you hold on to it, it becomes that much more valuable. But if you're a longer-term shareholder who's done their due diligence, which leads to the conclusion of this and is going to be a great company anyways, regardless of the S&P inclusion, and growth is going to come and brought up your position already, then you'd probably already seen this coming, or at least it was in the cards down a few years. But I think a lot of these people fall into a similar mindset that I spoke about earlier, that it will happen when it does. And it speaks more loudly about the confirmation of your thesis in buying Palantir, while we saw an opportunity that not everyone in the market is seeing in our own opinion at the time. And another byproduct too of being added to the index, which is also alluded to in more coverage in the media, but also analysts at financial institutions. This is an additional checkmark that can bring more attention to analysts to at least start putting out ratings and price targets for Palantir, because now they've got their big boy pants on in being in the index. So this is a mixed bag to me too, honestly, because yes, we can possibly get more minds focused on Palantir that might discover some great insights through their additional resources, and that's being used to research the company and maybe have connections to get an interview or just get documents or anything disclosed. And I'm all for getting as much information out as possible because, it brings certainty to investments, but typically there is a premium to pay when it comes to certainty and lowering risk, which goes back to that possible negative of especially if you're building a position. Do we even care for the added attention this brings and possibly makes the stock more expensive while you're in the accumulation mode? And I know this seems to be kind of skeptical of the whole matter for the S&P inclusion and diminishing the accomplishment a little bit, but I'm not. I wholeheartedly want Palantir to continue getting a positive reputation out in the marketplace to sell their products. Sure, there are byproducts for the stock as well, but as an investor, at least long term, my philosophy is really to focus on the underlying business and seeing what can help that out, since over the long term, that's a strong determinant of returns for investors. Although an entry point of what you're willing to pay for future returns will greatly change the math of a good versus bad investment, not investment advice, of course. So from going over a lot of these byproducts can be important for Palantir, but the timing and urgency of it doesn't matter to me in my personal opinion. If it happens to be announced on Friday coming up, then woohoo, we get the check mark. But if not, it's not going to change the fundamentals of the company or how they run it. They will continue to perform as they do regardless, and if it even extends to later after this year, then so be it. I just find it funny though too when questions about S&P inclusion come up during earnings calls, because my first thought is it's literally not in their hands at this point, and it's literally a waste of space to ask management, but at least I get a laugh out of it when I see it listed there as a possible question. That alongside the dividend one. So when it actually does happen with Palantir being added to the index, what would actually happen? Well, price, I don't know. And a lot of folks are arguing the demand and growth in institutional ownership recently shows this has been a long time coming and anticipated for and therefore prepared for. So the announcement won't necessarily have a real impact on the shares, but who knows when it does. But I'm basically certain that management will do an announcement or a press release of an article, and it will become more of a normal thing for Palantir to add and show up in their other press releases because it just showcases the prestige of being a top company, more reputable, and of course attracting more customers, kind of like a snowball. When they're at events and have signups, of course, too, or even introduced as guests to speak, it will become an added bullet point maybe that they can throw in here, just so they think that people might pay a little bit more attention here. So a lot of prestige factors in, at least for me personally, that I mentioned. So, but what are your thoughts though on S&P eligibility, especially with the Friday date coming around? Do you think it will happen? Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next video.